The elder woman in apartment 3B changed my life. I've lived on Maple Terrace for 5 years. It's the kind of place you move to when you're tired of city noise but not ready for the suburbs. A row of aging brick buildings, each with tiny balconies and flower pots that never seem to thrive. My neighbors are mostly quiet types, retirees, young professionals like me, and a few families tucked away on the first floor. It's a peaceful place, the kind where people nod in the hallway but rarely stop to chat. I've always liked that. I work from home, editing articles for an online magazine, so I notice more than most. Like how Mr. Carson in 2A is the first to check the mail every morning, or how the family in 1C always slams the door at exactly 7:45 a.m. but Mrs. Darrow in 3B? She was a mystery. She must have been in her 70s, maybe older, with silver hair pinned in a bun and a wardrobe straight out of the 1950s. She was polite, always giving me a tight-lipped smile when we passed in the hall, but we never exchanged more than a good morning. Her apartment was directly across from mine, and sometimes I'd hear her radio playing soft classical music late at night. Then came the smell. It started faint, something sour and musty, creeping into the hallway like a bad memory. At first, I thought it might be the trash chute or maybe someone's neglected fridge. But after a few days, it was clear, the smell was coming from Mrs. Darrow's door. It wasn't like Mrs. Darrow to ignore something like that. She was meticulous. I'd seen her scrubbing her doormat with a wire brush more than once. On the third day, when the smell became unbearable, I decided to knock on her door. No answer. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear the faint hum of her radio, but it was silent. That's when I called the building manager, Victor. He showed up grumbling with a ring of jangling keys, muttering about how people were always making him do extra work. Probably just left something in the fridge too long, he said as he unlocked the door. But when the door swung open, it wasn't the fridge. The apartment was pristine, just as I'd expected. The floor gleamed, the furniture was arranged with military precision, and the air, aside from the stench, was heavy with lavender air freshener. But there was something off. The silence felt oppressive, as though the space itself was holding its breath. Victor sniffed the air. "That's not food," he said, his gruffness replaced by a nervous edge. We followed the smell into the living room, where a massive antique trunk sat against the wall. It was ornate, covered in faded stickers from old ocean liners, the kind you'd see in black and white movies. Victor hesitated. "You think?" "We have to open it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The lid groaned as it opened, and the smell hit us like a wave. I clamped my hand over my nose, my eyes watering. Inside was a heap of fabric, old clothes, faded and moth-eaten. But as Victor began pulling them out, his hand froze mid-motion. Beneath the layers of fabric was a photograph. It was black and white, with scalloped edges, showing a group of people standing in front of what looked like a grand estate. At first, it seemed unremarkable, but then I noticed a familiar face. Mrs. Darrow, decades younger, stood in the center of the group. She wasn't smiling. In fact, none of them were. Their expressions were somber, almost fearful. But what truly made my stomach lurch was the figure standing just behind her, a man with sharp features and eyes that seemed to bore straight through the photo. "That's..." Victor trailed off, his face pale. "That's him. The one from the news." "The news?" I echoed, my heart racing. Victor nodded. "Back in the 70s. They called him the estate killer. He lured people to that house. None of them were ever found." I stared at the photo, my hands trembling. There was no mistaking it. Mrs. Darrow had been there, standing beside a man who'd gone down in history as one of the most notorious murderers of his time. But she was still alive. My head swam as Victor yanked his hand back, nearly dropping the photograph. "Maybe we should call the police," he said, his voice unsteady. "Wait," I blurted out. "We don't know anything for sure." Victor stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but I couldn't shake the thought that Mrs. Darrow wasn't just another victim. If she had been at that estate, and lived, then what else might she know? Or worse, what else might she have done? We finished rummaging through the trunk, but there was nothing else as damning as the photo. Just old clothes, yellowed letters I didn't dare open, and a tarnished locket. Inside the locket was another picture, but it wasn't Mrs. Darrow. It was a little girl, her round face solemn and eyes wide with fear. Victor backed out of the apartment. "I'm not sticking around for this. I'll call someone tomorrow, let them deal with it." He left me standing there, the air still thick with that sickly sweet smell. I don't know what possessed me, but I took the photo. My heart pounded as I crossed the hall to my own apartment and shut the door behind me. For hours, I stared at it, Googling everything I could about the estate killer. There were plenty of articles, stories about missing persons, gruesome discoveries, and rumors of accomplices. But there was no mention of Mrs. Darrow. The next morning, I heard her door creak open. I peeked through the peephole and saw her shuffling down the hall, her wide-brimmed hat perched neatly on her head, her leather bag swinging at her side. It was as though nothing had happened. When she returned from her walk, I couldn't help myself. I stepped into the hall, holding the photograph in my hand. "Mrs. Darrow," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She turned slowly, her expression blank. "Yes, I found this." I held the photo out to her, watching for a flicker of recognition. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. For a moment, I thought she might deny it, but then she smiled, a thin, brittle smile that sent a chill down my spine. "I wondered when someone would find that," she said softly. Her calmness unnerved me. "What happened at that house?" She tilted her head, studying me like a curious child. "You've read the stories, haven't you?" "Yes, but they don't mention you." "No," she said, tucking the photo into her bag. "They wouldn't." Before I could press her further, she turned and disappeared into her apartment, the door closing with a decisive click. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with questions. Was she a victim? An accomplice? Something worse? The smell was gone the next day, as if it had never been there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Weeks passed, and life on Maple Terrace returned to its quiet rhythm. But every time I saw Mrs. Darrow, I felt the weight of that photograph pressing against my mind. And then one morning, she was gone. Her apartment was cleared out overnight, no notice, no moving truck, just an empty space and a landlord who shrugged when I asked. "She left me this, though," he said, handing me a small envelope. My name was scrawled on the front in shaky handwriting. Inside was the locket. I opened it with trembling fingers, expecting the photo of the little girl. Instead, it was a picture of me, taken from some unknown angle, my face pale and wide-eyed, standing in her doorway the day I showed her the photograph. The locket snapped shut with a finality that echoed in the empty hall. I didn't sleep that night. The locket felt like a weight in my pocket, a chilling reminder of how little I truly understood. I thought about throwing it away, but some morbid curiosity held me back. The next morning, I slipped it into a drawer and locked it, hoping to bury the unease. Weeks turned into months, and life went on, Maple Terrace as quiet as ever. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint classical music through the walls, and I'd find myself staring at her old door, half expecting it to creak open. I never saw Mrs. Darrow again. But I think about her often, and the photo, and the way her brittle smile seemed to hold a secret too dark to share. Some nights, I wonder if the real mystery wasn't what happened in that house, but why she chose me to carry it forward.